You want to train your mind to make these sorts of analyses. Eventually, they'll be going on back here. That's the beautiful part, man. When you get to that spot as an engineer, it gets so much fun because you just kind of know. You're just like, oh man, these drums are not hitting hard enough, and it's because I have too much 50 hertz in my bass. It's not something people are generally going to be thinking when they're new to the game. Welcome to Kush After Hours. My name's Gregory Scott. Tonight, I want to talk to you about pulling together some of the larger and most critical concepts that we've talked about more than once on this show and give you a technique and a mindset to kind of pull together these big ideas in a practical way in your mixing to help you level up. So refresher course for those who are maybe new to the channel or have watched this stuff a year ago, 2 years ago, so fading from memory here. Number one concept, overarching music production, engineering, and mixing for me is everything affects everything. So this is a big one because what it means is that when you make an adjustment, no matter how small of an adjustment, small EQ boost on this, a little bit more compression on that, when you do that to one element in a mix, it's going to change and affect your perception of some, most, or all of the rest of the mix, like everything else in the mix. And one of the ways that I leverage this for the power of good is that if I have a mix that like maybe is feeling a little too dark, a little too heavy, and I want to lighten it up, I will reach for the brightest element in my mix, whether it's, usually for me, it's the overhead cymbals on my drum kit. Sometimes if I got some percussion going, a little shaker or whatever, and I will just nudge that up. Just take the fader and push up the volume of that channel by a half a dB, maybe a dB. Sometimes that's all the mix needs. If that doesn't feel like it's quite enough, I'll take my bass and I'll take the fader, I'll pull the volume of the bass down as an instrument by a half or 1 dB. And if you take the bass down and the treble up, well for you I guess would be bass down and treble up by a half or a single dB each, like that, even though these sounds are out at the edges of the spectrum and the edges of the mix like that, the whole mix will tilt with it. The perception of everything will be lighter and brighter, a little leaner, a little tighter. So that's your everything affects everything. Another thing we've talked about on this show repeatedly is making small moves. And for me, small moves means that my EQ, maybe I've got my frequency selected and 0.2, half a dB, a little bit like that. Coming over here, adjusting the compression, maybe taking the ratio from 2 to 1 to 3 to 1, or taking the threshold and just digging in like half or 1 dB more. And then coming over here and adjusting this fader by half a dB, and then taking this reverb send and turning it up by 1 dB. Like you see, this is the pattern. I'm trying to move fast, I'm trying to cycle through different sounds, move my focus around the mix, pull back, listen, see how everything is dancing, what's grabbing my attention in the wrong ways, go in there, drill in on that. So small move. We got everything affects everything. We got this propensity to make lots of small moves. And last, certainly not least, possibly most, is the big picture perspective, right? So understanding everything affects everything is maybe only helpful if you've got some sense of everything that's going on, which means you're not drilled down in on the snare drum to the exclusion of everything else. You're monkeying with the snare drum, so you got like your tools, right? And once you get that slot in the screw and you go to turn the screw, don't stare at the screw more and more. Pull back and take a look at whatever's being adjusted. So if you got a screw and it's leveling something out like that, pull your attention back while making the adjustment to see what's going on. So it's all well and good to talk about these things, right? But how do you do this in a mix meaningfully? So here's the exercise / technique / mindset for you to bring all these things together. And that is this concept that I'm going to call contrasting moves. So here's how that will look. The next time you go to mix, you're going to take your moves, whatever those moves might be in any given moment. Let's pick EQ, because EQ is, for me, a pretty simple example of this kind of concept. You're going to take your EQ move and try to split it into 2 different moves on 2 different things, such that you get the result that you want. So if you decide that your guitars need more bite to cut through the mix, and maybe one of your go-tos is 2.8 or 3.5K, something with brightness and hardness and some edge to it, and your instinct would be to just grab an EQ, go to 2.8K, push it up, I don't know, 2 dB. That's a lot for me, 2 dB. Instead, what I would like you to do is, as often as is realistic and feasible for you at this point in the game, because we don't want to bog you down too much in thinking, but when it occurs to you, try to take your move and break it apart. Cut that in half. Make it a 1 dB move there. And somewhere else, whether it's on a different bus or it's a different instrument, you're going to take something, I don't know, like 400 hertz, and you're going to do a 1 dB cut on it. Because 400 hertz, 400 or 500 hertz, somewhere around there, that's going to clear up your perception of 2.8K more on everything, right? So your guitars will have a little bit more of the bite you want, but then the whole mix will also get a little bit more of the bite that you want. Because pulling out 400 hertz decongests the low mids. There's a lot of pile up down there in that frequency space. You might not understand why I'm picking 400 hertz in relationship to 2.8K, and that's because I have yet to do the video on complementary frequencies, but it doesn't really matter. You don't have to know which frequency. You can just like, okay, I got this thing over here I'm trying to add bite to, and then listen to your mix, pull back, get your big picture perspective, go for the everything affects everything, and try to figure out what else is happening in this mix that is reducing the bite of the guitars. Because that's going on. If you don't have enough of something in something, that something might need more of that something, but oftentimes, most often, something else is also diminishing the impact or the perception of the thing that you're going for. And that reaches back to my example before of when I want the mix to just sort of feel leaner and brighter and tilt upwards, I push a little bit of my overhead cymbals and I pull down on my bass guitar, and lo and behold, everything just skews with those two elements. So this is the mindset, contrasting moves. It will help you to split your moves into smaller ones, which I'm a big fan of. It will force you to pull back and think a little bit more holistically about what you're doing and why. And again, you don't want to get lost in that, but you want to train your mind to make these sorts of analyses. Eventually, they'll be going on back here. That's the beautiful part, man. When you get to that spot as an engineer, it gets so much fun because you just kind of know. You're just like, oh man, these drums are not hitting hard enough, and it's because I have too much 50 hertz in my bass. It's not something people are generally going to be thinking when they're new to the game. But to just kind of know those things it frees your brain up from all these like, what do I need to do here and why? You get past that point and you get more into the instinctive space. And when those CPU cycles in our brains are freed up, then they can be applied to other things, which is like, okay, I just thought of a way to make my vocal more exciting, because I wasn't so bogged down in fine-tuning the minutia of the drum's impact, because I just understood that the impact of the drums was being diminished by the slow, heavy 50 hertz that's not moving at the same rate. The drums are doing this, and the 50 hertz is like, ugh, ugh. And so again, you put your finger on the woofer like we've talked about. You just kind of listen, you understand how these things are impacting the greater picture. So contrasting moves, splitting it up. If your vocal doesn't feel present enough, then grab 1.8K and push it up a little bit, and take your vocal effects, whatever it is, whether you got a little reverb, you got a delay on it, turn those up. And then if you feel like, okay, now I've turned up the vocal effect a little bit too much, then pull the whole volume fader down on the vocal to bring down the level of the vocal and the effect at the same time with it. And then maybe while you're doing that, also keep nudging up that 1.8K to get the vocal to be skinnier and clearer in a tighter space, which will open up more room around the vocal. So your other instruments start being like, the voice is speaking more at 1.8K, the effects are up, then you pull the effects and the voice down at the same time, and suddenly your guitars have more growl. Right? This is the kind of crap that you got to start like, man, it's such a moving, but you have my deepest sympathies if all of this is just sort of like, if I'm the teacher in Charlie Brown, but because I understand how hard it is. This is such a game of whack-a-mole that we're playing here. And if you're not old enough to know what the hell whack-a-mole is, that's that game where like little moles pop up and you got a hammer and you just whack it down, and as soon as you whack the one down, another one pops up somewhere else. And that really is that's what mixing is all about. You taking a little bit off of this thing. You're like, I'm going to de-harsh my vocal. Okay, well, crap, now the vocal's too smooth, and I can hear how the guitars are a little bit ringing, and you just keep moving around in circles like this. But I think that's actually the way this game is best played, is to just keep whacking the moles as they pop up. If you make a move and it uncovers a problem somewhere else, it doesn't mean you made the wrong move. It means now you can hear this other thing because it was probably there before. It was just being masked, or this other problem was looming even larger. So splitting your moves up into contrasting moves is a fantastic way to begin training your brain to synthesize this notion of everything affects everything, and how do I make more smaller moves, and I got to get into the big picture mode to understand these things in the first place and to have a sense of where else I need to be looking to fix this problem that I'm hearing. So splitting an EQ move in half and figuring out a different EQ move somewhere else, turning the effects on something up while pulling down the dry signal. What are some other contrasting moves that you can make? If the mix is feeling not dense enough and urgent enough, then maybe instead of adding another 2 decibels of gain reduction on the compressor, you add 1 or even a half a dB, and then you also add a little bit more saturation before and or after the compressor. And so you start layering things up, because if you can get, this is especially true with plugins, and one of the things that I think engineers had to figure out when we made the transition from analog to digital, early plugins had problems with aliasing distortions and quantization errors, rounding errors, and the workstations had these problems. And so we were encouraged early on to use as few plugins as possible, which mirrored our analog workflow, where we just you had one EQ on the voice, and then you had one compressor on the voice, and maybe you had 1 or 2 effects on the voice, and that's kind of it. But we're at a place now where, and this is something I picked up from Chad Blake, it's certainly, he didn't invent this, but most of the top level guys I know, they do this now. We're using more and more and more plugins, doing more and more and more things in tinier and tinier and tinier adjustments. And so I guess the last thing that I'll leave you with on this is stick with the moves that you got. All right? So one of the ways to keep moving forward in a mix is to literally not turn around and move backwards, not undo what you've done. What I find myself doing as of late, and I'm just really, really happier and happier with the results, is that, let's say I'll pull up an EQ. I like tools that are kind of limited, so I'll pull up a hammer on a vocal, and maybe I've used all 3 bands, which is easy to do on that EQ, and I'm pulling a little 300 out of the voice, and I'm putting a little bit of 1.6K in, and I'm taking out a little bit of 3.5 or 2.5. And I've just got these 3 small moves. I'm just kind of shaping it, and it sounds good. And then at some point I realize, okay, I actually need more bite. Maybe taking that 2.5K out with the hammer kind of softened the voice up a little bit too much. Rather than going back into the hammer and putting more 2.5K back in, undoing some of the cut that I did, I will bring in another EQ, a different EQ. Maybe because the hammer is so broad, I'll bring in something that's a little bit tighter, like the Axis or the Electra. And if the hammer's pulling out 2.5K and I want a little bit more bite, I'll go to 3.2K. And I'll just inch a little bit back in with that EQ. And so I tend to I have 2 or 3 times as many bands of EQ happening these days as I used to. But they're all doing a lot less. And sometimes they're pushing and pulling against each other, which is really, really cool. And as I keep shaving the sounds into being like this, and sculpting and chipping away here, nudging and bending and pushing that, the things are just coming together much more coherently. And I find that I'm not undoing, because when I go back and I undo things, like decreasing the cut that I did previously on an EQ, I kind of falter. Something, I don't know if it's psychological or the mix itself, whatever I did, I trust that that was the right move. And again, if some other problem presents itself, I then address that problem with a new tool in a new way. And if it's going to be a big kind of a thing, I will split it up into multiple moves. And so I, at this point in time, have lost track of the things that I've said. I'm a little minty fresh here on the THC mints, so I think I'm going to go and have some more tea and clear my mind, come back and record another episode. And I hope that this has been helpful to you in some way. I believe it will be. And so, next time you're mixing, think of old Gregory Scott in the background being like, what's that guy talking about? Splitting moves. Let me see. All right. head. Kush After Hours. Talk to you soon.